Transgender terms and how to use them. This is an audio visual of our Trans 101 Glossary, version 6.0, 2023. In this video, we have included Te Reo Māori translations together with the English terms, rather than as a separate section with etymology. The webpage and PDF versions are available from our website at genderminorities.com/glossary. Gender or gender identity, tuakiri a ira. Gender refers to a person's recognition of themselves as male or female, or something else. While some people's self-perception is closely related to how others see them, transgender people are more likely to have their own understanding of their gender. Social gender refers to the gender which one is perceived as in a social context. Registered gender refers to a person's gender as recorded in their identification documents. Gender is often used synonymously with sex. In some circles, gender identity is falling out of favour, as one does not simply identify as a gender, but is that gender. Transgender, irawhiti, irahuri. Transgender is used in two discrete ways. 1. To describe a person whose gender is different from the sex they were assigned at birth. 2. As an umbrella term which emerged in the 1960s, to unite people regardless of medical status, where medical sectors insisted that transsexuals were fundamentally different from transvestites, for example. People under this umbrella may describe themselves as transgender, as a wide variety of identities, some of which are defined in this glossary, or may not consider themselves transgender. Many transgender people undertake medical treatments to change their sex characteristics. However, a transgender identity is not dependent on or indicative of medical procedures, sexual orientation, sex characteristics, physical anatomy, or how one is perceived in daily life. Transsexual, an older term coined by clinicians in the 1950s, still preferred by some people who have changed or seek to change their bodies, often surgically. Many people do not identify with this term, as it has sometimes been used to exclude people who do not change their bodies or change their bodies in limited ways, e.g. not having surgery. Trans and transstar, used as an abbreviation of transgender or transsexual, or as an umbrella similar to transgender. Some people use trans with the asterisk, pronounced transstar. This is to indicate inclusion of all people who are not cis. Others see transstar as unnecessary due to trans and transgender already having this meaning. Cis, cisgender or cissexual, ira pumo. Cis is a prefix or adjective that means not trans. Cisgender people identify more or less with the gender assigned to them at birth. In discussions regarding trans issues, one would differentiate between women who are trans and women who aren't by saying trans women and cis women. Cis is not an insult, but a neutral descriptor, much like heterosexual is to homosexual. Cishet. Cishet is a contraction of cisgender and heterosexual, meaning the person is both. Gender expression or presentation. Whakaputa a ira, the outward expression of one's gender. For example, through clothing, hairstyle, voice, makeup, body shape, and behaviours. Most transgender people face barriers, such as discrimination, that make it hard to have their preferred gender expression or presentation. Sex. Sex is not fixed or immutable, but socially constructed system of assignment and classification of people, typically as male or female. In the 1400s, gender and sex were synonymous and have largely remained interchangeable for some 600-odd years. Modern definitions of sex often lean more on biological aspects than spiritual and mental aspects. These aspects of sex are often still socially regarded as male or female, despite a general understanding that sex characteristics exist on a spectrum. Sex can mean many things, including sex is assigned at birth, assigning an infant's sex and gender based on imprecise perceptions of their sex characteristics, generally only the external genitalia. Registered sex, sometimes referred to as legal sex. The sex registered on a person's legal identity documents, for example, a passport or birth certificate, though these do not always match. Perceived sex or social sex, the sex a person is seen as and treated as socially. This can be different in different social contexts. Sex characteristics, often incorrectly termed biological sex. See the next section. Sex characteristics. Ahutanga, a ira. Historically, Sex characteristics referred to what is seen as typical and innate characteristics for someone of a particular gender. This often included concepts such as a spiritual essence, appearance, clothing, behaviors, and sexual orientation. Displaying inappropriate sex characteristics, such as homosexuality, cross-dressing, is often illegalized. Chromosomes were first discovered in 1882 and hormones in 1902, which influenced a shift in the meaning of sex characteristics toward physical anatomy biology. Feminist discourse in the 1960s and 1970s, along with the sexual revolution of the 1970s and 1980s, both furthered the understanding that there was not one single way to be a certain gender and no innate characteristics of a particular sex. In modern times, many people still think that ways of thinking and behaving are characteristics that are based on sex. Others use sex characteristics to refer to primary sex characteristics, such as external genitalia, gonads or reproductive organs and fertility, gametes, chromosomes, sex hormones, as well as secondary sex characteristics, including breast development, patterns of hair growth such as facial hair and body hair, patterns of body fat and muscle distribution, and voice development. Sex characteristics can be innate or may change later, including through medical treatments. Variations of sex characteristics. Rerekētanga, ahutanga, aira. Variations of sex characteristics generally refer to a person having different physical sex characteristics than what is typical for someone of their gender. This term is commonly applied to intersex individuals who have innate variations of sex characteristics which do not fit into a male-female binary model, for example, being born with XX and XY chromosomes. It is sometimes applied to transgender individuals who have innate variations of sex characteristics which typically fit into a male-female binary model, but don't match the side of the binary that is typical for their gender. For example, a trans man's innate sex characteristics might include a vagina, which is not typical for men. AFAB and AMAB, sometimes KFAB and KMAB, acronyms meaning assigned female at birth or assigned male at birth. This is a description of the medico-legal binary sorting process that is applied to all infants. When the C is added, it stands for coercively, to recognize that children and babies do not have a choice in this process. In any case, when it's necessary to refer to the birth-assigned sex of a trans person, this is the best way to do it. Note, intersex people are often reassigned a sex at birth, sometimes multiple times. Be cautious applying this framework to intersex people. The gender binary, sex binary, a scientifically incorrect theory in which sex, gender, or both are viewed as consisting solely of two categories, termed male and female, with two sets of typical matching sex characteristics. The gender-sex binary assumes that sex and/or gender are unchangeable, that male and female are inherently separate, and asserts that other possibilities are non-existent, inferior, disordered, or dangerous. Gender essentialism or sex essentialism. Gender essentialism or sex essentialism is the theory that there are only two genders, sexes, and that each sex has innate, immutable, universal characteristics that are the same for all people of that sex, such as a common socialization, spiritual essence, biology, or psychology. Sex essentialism is a subset of essentialism and is a basic type of sexism. Trans woman. Ira tangata wahine, whakawahine. Trans woman refers to a woman who was assigned male at birth. She may or may not be identified by others as trans, and may or may not identify herself as trans. It is grammatically and definitionally correct to include a space between trans and women. Trans man. Ira tangata tane, whakatane. Trans man refers to a man who was assigned female at birth. He may or may not be identified by others as trans, and may or may not identify himself as trans. It is grammatically and definitionally correct to include a space between trans and man. Binary, tahurua, used as an adjective to describe the binary genders, i.e. female, woman, girl, or male, man, boy. Non-binary, ira tahurua kore, tahine, an umbrella term for all genders other than just female, woman, girl, or male, man, boy. Used as an adjective, e.g. Elsa is a binary trans woman and Jessie is non-binary. Transition, whakamana ira, gender affirmation. Transition is a broad term referring to changes that transgender people make as part of being transgender. Transition often includes social elements such as changing one's clothes, hair, name, identification documents, etc. It may also include medical treatments, such as laser hair removal, taking hormones, or having surgeries. Every person makes different changes, and there is usually no clear start or end point for a transition. Rainbow, SOGIESC, SOGIESC, and MOGAI. MOGAI, Takatapui, Tehunga Aniwaniwa. Rainbow or rainbow communities is an umbrella term similar to LGBT+. The term rainbow seeks to unite people of minority sexual orientations, genders, and sex characteristics without needing to rely on longer acronyms such as GLBT, LGBT, LGBTQ, LGBTQIA, SOGIESC, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and sex characteristics, MOGAI, marginalized orientations, gender alignments, and intersex. The term rainbow is a reference to the rainbow flag and the arc of a rainbow covering everyone. MVPFAFF+, MVPFAFF. MVPFAFF is an acronym meaning Mahu, Hawaii and Tahiti, Vaka Salewalewa, Fiji, Palopa, Papua New Guinea, Fa'afafine and Fatama, Samoa, Akava'ine, Rarotonga, Whakaleite, Tonga, Whakawhawhine, New, plus other Pacific Island genders such as Hakahuahine, Tokelo, and Reire, Tahiti. MVPFAFF was coined in 2011 by Felicia Brown Acton to provide an alternative to terms like LGBT, which did not fit within the specifics of the many varied Pacific Island cultures. Note, Vaka Salewalewa is often considered an offensive term. Sexual orientation, Aronga Taira. Sexual orientation is a social categorization of a person's pattern of sexual instinct, erotic desire, physical, emotional, spiritual, or psychological attraction to particular demographics of people. A demographic can be an attribute such as gender, ethnicity, size, or social class. But gender is the most commonly named when discussing sexual orientation. This is not to be confused with sexual instinct and sexual behavior as a whole. Prior to the creation of the concept, sexual behaviors were categorized and sometimes illegalized, but orientations were not. The concept of sexual orientation is often credited to Hungarian journalist Karl Maria Kurtbeny, who in the 1860s coined terms to describe sexual experiences: heterosexual, homosexual, and monosexual, meaning self-sexual or masturbation, with the idea of unifying homosexual people against anti-sodomy laws. In the early 1900s, Austrian neurologist Sigmund Freud brought sexual orientation into public discourse with his theory that heterosexuality was not innate or inherent. Some sexual orientations include positioning one's own gender, e.g. lesbian indicates one is a woman who is attracted to women. The three most common orientations which do not do this are queer, bisexual, and pansexual. Note that gender and sexual orientation are not the same thing. A trans person can have any sexual orientation. For example, a trans woman who is primarily attracted to other women may identify as lesbian. Asexual orientation, Aronga Taira Kore. Asexuality in humans typically refers to an explicit absence of sexual instinct or erotic desire. It is not a lack of something that should exist, it is simply an absence. Asexual orientation refers to a person's enduring pattern of non-sexual and non-erotic physical, romantic, emotional, and/or spiritual attraction to others. An asexual person may experience sexual attraction in some circumstances, or have sexual relationships for a vast number of different reasons other than sexual instinct or erotic desire. This experience is very common in faith-based communities, which value sexual behaviors for reproduction and denounce sexual instinct and erotic desire. It is important to note that asexuality is distinct from celibacy, which means abstinence from sexual behaviors. People have discussed an absence of sexual desire in many ways throughout history. Asexuality was explicitly pathologized in the 1980s when inhibited sexual desire was first added to the DSM-3. In the 2000s and 2010s, asexual people connected online, particularly those who were connected to the LGBTI+ social scenes, or saw asexuality as an inherently LGBTI+ experience. The Writing Themselves in 2020 LGBTI+ community survey showed that asexual rainbow people were most often non-binary. Romance, romantic, The dominant culture framework for understanding and organizing social expectations of behaviors in sexual relationships, including specific methods of displaying attraction and affection, i.e. dating, monogamy, marriage, nuclear families. Many people use the term to refer to positive feelings they have in relation to forming certain types of relationships and experiencing specific types of courtship. The term romance originally referred to stories about knights and courtly love, which is part of the basis of modern romance. Bisexual, taerarua. Bisexuality is a sexual orientation. Most bisexual people identify their attractions as being toward men and women. In LGBT social scenes, it is more common for bisexual people to identify as being attracted to more than one gender, or to their own and other genders. Bisexual was first used to mean having the characteristics of both men and women, including men's or women's sexual instinct. Later, the definition narrowed to mean both heterosexual and homosexual attraction, which become common use since the 1950s. Pansexual, taeraro. Pansexual is a sexual orientation that either does not consider gender or is toward people of any gender. It inherently explicitly includes transgender and non-binary genders. Some pansexuals experience attraction based on characteristics other than gender. Pansexual does not necessarily mean without preference. Historically, pansexual has also been used to mean including all sexual orientations. Heteroflexible or homoflexible, similar to bisexual or pansexual, but with a stated heterosexual or homosexual preference respectively. Heteroflexible indicates that one is primarily interested in heterosexual relationships, but is flexible when it comes to sexual activities. Homoflexible indicates that one is primarily interested in homosexual relationships, but is flexible when it comes to sexual activities. Chaser, a person who sees trans people as inherently sexual and sexually objectifies them, as opposed to someone who simply is predominantly attracted to a transgender, e.g. trans women. A chaser does not view trans people respectfully as whole people with humanity and agency, but rather as players in a sexual fantasy. Heteronormative, or heteronormativity. This refers to the idea that relationships between heterosexual masculine cis men and heterosexual feminine cis women are normal, natural, or right, while all other relationships are viewed as abnormal, inferior, or wrong in contrast. It refers to systems and society being structured around this idea. Queer, broadly used to indicate that one rejects heteronormativity and is not heterosexual, though sometimes queer is also used by heterosexual transgender people. Queer is inherently political, rejecting enforced heterosexual narratives and rejecting assimilationist, homonormative respectability politics that reinforce them. In the late 1980s, gay liberation movements were fighting for acceptance and inclusion in the straight world, including marriage, military inclusion, and adoption. Many wanted to distance themselves from the bad radical queers who did not or could not assimilate. Black, trans, disabled, HIV positive, and other highly marginalized LGBT+ people, particularly people of color, rejected assimilation into heteronormative society and rejected homonormative respectability politics. They reclaimed queer. From these roots came the association of queer with political and social radicalism. Genderqueer, irake, similar to queer but more specific to rejecting binary genders. Those who identify as genderqueer may identify as neither male nor female, may see themselves outside of or in between the binary gender boxes, or may simply feel restricted by gender labels, or the idea of having to define themselves. Some genderqueer people do identify within the binary, e.g. genderqueer women, but reject the conventions and expectations associated with that gender. Sexqueer, a rejection of labeling one's physical body as female or male. Being sexqueer is not indicative of one's current anatomy, birth assignment, or birth anatomy, and should definitely not be confused with intersex. Intersex, taihemarua. Intersex describes a range of over 40 innate variations of sex characteristics that a person may have from birth, which are ambiguous in the context of male-female sex binary. Intersex can be used as an umbrella for people who have an intersex variation and is sometimes used as an individual identity, e.g. I am an intersex man, or I'm intersex. A person may not know that they have an intersex variation until they reach puberty and their body changes differently than expected, though most people who are diagnosed with an intersex variation were diagnosed at birth. When an intersex infant is born with ambiguous external genitalia, parents and clinicians typically assign them a binary sex and perform surgical operations to conform the infant's body to that assignment. However, this practice is increasingly recognized as unethical and harmful. It is important to know that an infant undergoing, for example, an operation to create a vagina generally has to have vaginal dilation and further surgeries throughout their childhood. No child should be needlessly subjected to this. Being intersex does not necessarily imply anything regarding one's gender, anatomy, orientation, or trans status. Most intersex people do not see themselves as transgender or rainbow. Crossdresser. This word describes someone who enjoys dressing as other genders. It can include people who primarily identify with their gender assigned at birth. Cross-dressing is a form of gender expression, and for many, this is an integral part of their identity. Cross-dressing is not necessarily tied to erotic activity, nor is it indicative of one's sexual orientation or gender. Do not use this term to describe someone unless they self-identify with this word. Queens, drag kings, drag. Drag queens and drag kings are cross-dressing performers who take on stylized, exaggerated gender presentations for show. For many, this is also an integral part of their identity. People of any gender can do drag. Drag is not determinant on one's gender. Historically, the term drag queen or simply queen refers to trans women. Men who cross-dressed as women exclusively for performance were called butch queens. Many older generation trans women in New Zealand still prefer the term queen. However, others may see this as an insult. Use with caution, and always follow the trans person's lead. Gender fluid, ira huri. Gender fluid can refer to a person whose gender changes over time, often between multiple binary or non-binary genders. As a concept, gender fluidity can refer to any changeableness around gender and gender standards. This should not be confused with the first definition. Bigender, a non-binary gender identity that indicates having two different genders. They could be both male or female, or be any other two genders. This term is different from and should not be confused with the term two-spirit, a gender identity specific to certain Native American and First Nations cultures. Neutrois and agender, ira kore. One who feels neutral in their gender, or an absence of gender, or who rejects the influence of gender on their person. Sometimes the term non-gendered is used similarly. Identifying as neutrois or agender is neither indicative of one's anatomy, birth assignment, nor pronoun use. They can be used in conjunction with another gender signifier, for example, neutrois woman. Androgyne, a person who feels both masculine and feminine, or who has a gender expression with both masculine and feminine characteristics. Again, only use this term if it is the person's own self-identification. Femme, an identity or presentation of non-heteronormative reclaimed queer femininity. Femme can be an adjective, she's a femme woman. A verb, she loves to femme up. Or a noun, she's a femme. Although commonly associated with feminine, lesbian, queer women, it's used by many to describe a distinct gender identity and/or expression, and does not necessarily imply that one also identifies as a woman. Some people use femme in the same way, or simply to mean feminine. Butch, an identity or presentation of non-heteronormative reclaimed queer masculinity. Butch can be an adjective, she's a butch woman. A verb, she went home to butch up. Or a noun, she identifies as a butch. Although commonly associated with masculine queer lesbian women, it's used by many to describe a distinct gender identity and/or expression, and does not necessarily imply that one also identifies as a woman. Gender dysphoria, tirengi a ira. Gender dysphoria is a clinical diagnostic term referring to dissonance between one's assigned gender and/or body and their personal sense of self. As diagnostic category, it is still often seen as a pathology. Gender dysphoria is now being moved away from in favor of more broad recognition of gender incongruence. Gender euphoria. Gender euphoria is a theoretical term used to describe the opposite of gender dysphoria. It is sometimes used to describe positive feelings about a person's gender and being respected due to experiencing and expecting a lack of respect. Generally, this is perceived as strengths-based, despite being a deficit-based model. We recommend avoiding this term outside of a self-descriptive context. Detransition or retransition. Retransition or detransition is when a person who previously identified as transgender now identifies as cisgender or a different transgender identity. E.g., they used to identify as non-binary. They now identify as a trans woman. Retransition acknowledges the possibility of transitioning to different identities multiple times and affirms that transition-related healthcare should be available, whether a person is affirming a cisgender or transgender identity. Detransition usually only refers to affirming a cisgender identity and is often used in relation to preventing access to transition-related healthcare. Transphobia, mai ira whiti, mai ira huri. Transphobia consists of three main parts: anti-trans stereotypes, anti-trans prejudice, and anti-trans discrimination. Any of these elements on its own can be transphobia. Stereotypes include, for example, the idea that trans people aren't real, that they are delusional, or that they are dangerous. Misconceptions of biology and ideas of gender oppression revolving around reproductive capacity, gender essentialism, are two further examples of stereotypes or overgeneralized ideas. Prejudicial feelings are usually based on these stereotypical ideas and may include fear, anger, discomfort, distrust, disgust, or hatred directed towards trans people. Discrimination is actions based on prejudice. Transphobia is used similarly to homophobia. Transmisogyny, discrimination against trans women, AMAB transgender people, and some intersex people who are perceived as having male bodies and feminine genders. It involves the combination of misogyny or hatred of women with transphobia. A key aspect of transmisogyny is the double bind. Trans women are presumed to embody the worst of masculinity, sexually aggressive or predatory, violent, and domineering, treated with the worst of misogyny, as objects to be used, without agency, hypersexualized, as though their existence is too seductive, and as though they are over-emotional and irrational. In a patriarchal society, it is seen as a threat to masculinity when people who could have been men reject manhood in favor of a lower status position, womanhood. With feminist frameworks, AMAB transgender people are often seen as having to work harder to not be dangerous, transfeminized debt. Consequently, they experience discrimination and violence, including sexual violence, at much higher rates than women in the general population. Additionally, it is in the best interest of those who would mistreat trans women to ensure that society sees trans women in this way, resulting in dedicated anti-trans campaigners manufacturing transmisogynist disinformation. These factors contribute to transmisogyny, both interpersonally and structurally. TMA, TME. TMA is an acronym that stands for Transmisogyny Affected, an umbrella term for everyone who is targeted and/or affected by transmisogyny. TME is an acronym that stands for Transmisogyny Exempt, an umbrella term for people who are not the target of transmisogyny. TERF. TERF is an acronym for Trans-Exclusionary Radical Feminist. Trans-Exclusionary Radical Feminism is a small subsection of radical feminism. While radical feminism focuses on its particular view of male supremacy, trans-exclusionary radical feminism focuses on categorizing trans women as men and removing transgender human rights, legal protections, healthcare access, and supportive social environments. TERFs are usually socially conservative, against sex workers' rights, kink, contraceptives, abortion rights, vaccination, and pharmaceuticals. TERF ideology has strong links to primitivism and other movements supporting naturalness, Eurocentric family values, and white supremacist movements. Cissexism and cis supremacy. Bias in favor of cis people over trans people, or beliefs that cis people are inherently superior to trans, more real, more natural, etc. This often refers to systems which advantage cis people over trans people, or unconscious systems of thought, rather than transphobic individuals. Passing. Being read, i.e. seen, as the gender one wishes to be read as. The term passing is falling out of fashion as it is seen to imply that one should desire to look cisgender. Closeted and stealth. Closeted, or in the closet, refers to trans people who have not transitioned and whose transgender identity is a secret. They are still perceived by others to be the gender they were assigned at birth. Stealth refers to people who have already transitioned and who actively keep their trans history a secret. They are usually perceived to be the opposite binary gender than what they were assigned at birth. Note, everyone has a right to privacy. Bottom surgery, SRS or GRS. Bottom surgery, sexual reconstruction surgery, SRS, or genital reconstruction surgery, GRS, refer to several different types of gender affirmation or transition-related surgical procedures which alter the patient's genitalia. These terms are usually preferred over sex change operation or anything with reassignment. Some trans people have reclaimed sex change to acknowledge that by any definition of sex, transgender people can change their sex. Not all transgender people choose to or can afford to have GRS. Subsequently, overemphasizing the importance of surgeries should be avoided. Ngā mihi, thank you for being here, and please reach out for any further information. genderminorities.com. Gender Minorities Aotearoa.